I'm Blake Hargreaves. Welcome to Future Stops. The music you're hearing is the premiere of a new work titled Voiceless Mass. The composer, Raven Chacon, whose musical palette encompasses the disparate universes of chamber music and caustic noise performance, now enters into the realm of church spaces with this his first work featuring the pipe organ. He brings to the instrument a unique perspective, as his first musical experience was traditional Navajo music.
I grew up on the Navajo reservation, which is about 4 hours west of Albuquerque. And the only musician in my family really is my grandpa. He sings a lot of traditional Navajo music, but that was kind of the early experience with just hearing somebody play music. And later on, the family moved to the big city, Albuquerque, and I was about 10 years old or so. And we met this woman who gave us piano lessons. And so I studied the piano at a young age, and I didn't stick with it too long. I did about 3 or 4 years of that. But what it did give me is, that knowledge of reading notes, and applying it to learning other instruments. So, I eventually took that and taught myself to play the guitar, or string instruments. And so I was interested in just making sound, and of course that extends to other kinds of things. You try to build your own instruments, and cassette tapes were still something very ubiquitous back then. Experimenting with those, taking them out of the case and putting them backwards, trying to cut them up and everything. Yeah, just making music. And eventually I went and enrolled in the university and studied more formally, and did that all the way through a master's degree. I ended up doing that at Cal Arts, and that was something totally different. I mean, when I went into this, deciding to study formally, I had my own experiments I was doing, and I had been able to research a little bit about other things, other 20th century music that was happening. But it wasn't until I went to California that I realized, there's all these, other people doing it on a kind of DIY level, and I was already making noise and doing this kind of thing. I didn't realize there was really a community of people doing this, though, and I kind of had that end of it while being out there. Also, I was studying with some people I really enjoyed their music: James Tenney, Morton Subotnick, Wadada Leo Smith. All of these folks were the professors at Cal Arts, where did the MFA. So,
Well, it sounds like you always had a sort of unique perspective. You've described your practice as researching instruments. What do you mean by that?
well, with composition, I think I get this question a lot, and sometimes you come upon uh, discussions with other composers, or I share a concert with somebody. A lot of this discussion was when I was, studying music too, about, you saw emerging composers, young composers, established composers, maybe processing a bass clarinet through a max patch or something, or doing different kinds of affecting instruments. And to me, that's not my reason for making chamber music, or composing with those instruments. I still feel like I'm researching all of them. Like I don't know enough about them. There's shoot, hundreds of these instruments that have been used in, of course, the classical genre, and wherever else they existed before that history. And so I'm still fascinated by that. I don't think the bass clarinet can be improved, or at least for myself, I'm not finished exploring what they can do. So it's constantly trying to understand what they can do, and learning, through extended techniques. People are constantly developing extended techniques for these instruments, and just in appreciating how they're built, how they work, what they can do, and even when maybe I feel like that's like I've learned, well, I'll never feel like I've learned enough, but then in combination with other instruments, all the amazing sounds and timbres and combinations that can come from that. And so, yeah, so that's continuing work. Every time I take on a new chamber composition, it's probably because there's going to be an instrument involved that I haven't written enough for or don't know enough about. And so in the case of this one I did recently for the pipe organ, I know nothing about the pipe organ. I still feel like of course, I mean, I learned quite a bit just to make the piece happen, but I feel like that's a whole universe in itself that uh, I hope to understand more, and given another opportunity, maybe to, if not work with this piece more, do another one.
Well, and how did you find the organ in terms of like your goals with the piece and the result, not having worked with it before?
Well, I mean, I guess my approach to it, and having started on the piano, was not to write, as if it was a piano. And I think I knew enough just from listening to other organ music, especially from the 20th century, um, that was not the approach that I wanted to do, and that this is a completely different instrument that doesn't have to be as if you were just going to write for a piano. Writing for as if it was a piano was the last thing I wanted to do. I, Instead, I was interested in all the different timbres that could happen. I think a lot of this work, and also my electronic or noise work is kind of functions in the same way, where there's maybe an exploration of the extreme low registers and high registers, maybe at the same time. This was a piece that was it was commissioned by Present Music, wonderful new music organization in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they do an annual Thanksgiving concert. And I think, quite honestly, they probably felt an obligation to have Indigenous voice in this. Um, Myself, Navajo, coming from Navajo Nation, they knew of my work, but I think they were conflicted of having a Thanksgiving concert and not not knowing what to say with it. So they reached out for a piece. And I mean, hey, I have no problem with Thanksgiving. I love to eat on Thanksgiving, but of course, it has a complicated history. Not necessarily one that affected my tribe directly, as we're more in the Southwest, and we didn't have that encounter of the East Coast, like the Wampanoag, and some of these other tribes. But still, taking on that invitation and saying, well, what can be said, and um, getting excited about being able to use the organ. They had the venue of the Cathedral of Saint John the Evangelist in Milwaukee, and just starting to think about what all this combination of uh, events in this situation and the invitation would mean to write a piece for that. And so that was the beginning of that.
Not only does this work represent the first time Chacon writes for a provocative occasion like Thanksgiving, it also marks the first time he writes a work to be performed in a Christian church on an instrument with such a strong Christian identity, the pipe organ. Chacon confronted these provocations with research and contemplation.
I wanted to think about maybe the building, where the organ was housed, and thinking about the history of that. But I was trying to find the earliest organ in the Americas, or at least in the United States. And I couldn't find any concrete information about that. But I did find one article where somebody was saying the earliest known organ in the United States was in 1610 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So, in my area, it's definitely one of the earliest churches, uh, Christian churches, a Catholic church. And so I was trying to maybe think about that history, and surely I'm going to be researching this more. But this area of northern New Mexico has this history of the conquistadors and the Spanish and the priests coming in and all operating together and enslaving the native people in northern New Mexico. Eventually, there was a revolt in 1680, which, kind of uh, took back the land, undid a lot of some of this oppression that was happening. And I think the ultimate results of that is you have this community that's, wasn't the indigenous community wasn't completely exterminated, but there's a culture that's blended from Spanish and indigenous in this region. And of course, thinking of that history, I think there was a starting point of considering then that this would be taking into account the church, and also thinking, well, how then are not only uh, music, how is music integrated inside of the building of the church, but then what are the opportunities for other voices in these churches? It's usually a place of sermon, it's a place of silence a lot of times. I mean, it's a place to go and reflect, a place to go and pray. Myself, even growing up Catholic, half Catholic, I should say, and and uh, and thinking of that, there's voices. There's the voice from God. There's the non-voice, the reflection, the silence, the praying, um, and starting to think then about current times, about protest. A lot of that has been in my work recently. Of course, we had all these events, in the States and elsewhere, of people, angry at the police about the shootings, all these other events. There's been a lot of things in Canada, around the church, around the Truth and Reconciliation, residential schools. And also back here in the Southwest, there was also, going back to the history of the conquistadors, the taking down of statues of those, of that history. There's were quite a few statues for a conquistador named Oñate, who was cutting off the feet, I think it was the left foot of every Pueblo man here hundreds of years ago. So when they took down the statue of him, actually a good friend and collaborator, musician and artist, a friend of mine, was shot at this protest last summer. Insane things happening. And so for raising his voice, and so all of that went into this piece. All of that got me thinking, and not just about the church. It's really thinking about spaces. I mean, this space could be a courtroom, as was just 60 miles down the street from Milwaukee. You had that Kyle Rittenhouse verdict also happened. It actually came. The verdict came down while I was out there 2 days before this piece premiered. You had that in that region. You also had, you have universities that pride itself on an exchange of dialogue, but also thinking, well, who can end up in those spaces? Sometimes you have a university that's quite expensive to attend, or there's barriers that's not allowing, poor folks who can't afford it to go into these spaces. And even when they're there, they might not feel that they can say what they want to say. And so it was really thinking about, space, buildings, gathering, what gathering can mean individually or as a group. And also thinking also of the mass, the musical form of the mass, and the history of that combined with the church, with the organ.
And so, how did you feel the organ played its role in your exploration of these issues with your piece?
Yeah, it was. I mean, you're right. Ultimately, I had to write the piece, stop conceptualizing it, and and get to a point where, what can be. Well, first I decided to call it Voiceless Mass, and there wasn't going to be any actual voice in it. But I wanted to think, okay, well, maybe some of these voice instruments can actually sound like the human voice. And so back to thinking about the organ creating this kind of bed or structure or skeleton for the piece. Then thinking of ways of maybe weaving around these other so-called voices into this, the percussion kind of singing or screeching, even screaming at times with what it can do. The same with the flute, um, and just kind of having this harmonic basis as well. I mean, this is something I don't know about, but I don't know how much I could have done anything microtonally with the organ, but that was okay. I mean, a lot of times I'm not a huge tuning person, but a lot of the chamber music I make does go to the quarter tone level, so the strings almost completely played with quarter tones, and I liked having that interplay between the fixed pitches of equal temperament pitches of the organ, and then having the quarter tone off with the other instruments.
And this was performed obviously in a church. So, how do you feel the space played its role in terms of this piece that had in a way a sacred meaning? And you're in a space designated as sacred by the people who use it.
Yeah, I mean, I was completely honored to be able to have this piece be in dialogue with the space, and the open mindedness of um, the cathedral of Saint John the Evangelist, and the folks that steward the organ also. Were very helpful in just making the entire work happen. I think the community there also appreciated that discussion. So that was it. And it's not that I have a solution or anything like that, but what art can do is bring up these beginnings of a conversation, perhaps. And for me, that's if a chamber piece can accomplish that, that's huge for me. I mean, and that's maybe what I seek in music sometimes. At the same time, music doesn't have to do any of that. Music can just exist. And so the space itself, I mean, just if you're talking about the acoustics of the space, uh, absolutely beautiful. And there's two organs that are being used in this. I don't know enough about how this works, but they were, I suppose, daisy chained. And so you would hear it on both ends. You would hear the organ that's in the apse, and you would hear the other one on the other side. And so just to the way that it would fill the entire space. And for myself, I mean, I wrote the piece without having the ability to go out there and not only work with the organ but hear the space itself. So that was always, that was a little scary up until the time we actually got to rehearse in there. And as I say, that the organ was the the foundation of the work. I mean, it couldn't have been any other way. This overpowered, if it wanted to, everything else in the space. So what that led me to do, I mean, the assumption that that was going to happen led me to write this instruction into the piece that the other instruments should be separated and spaced out around the space. They were not going to be in a traditional configuration cluster on a stage, for instance. The only way they were really going to be heard is if they were dispersed within the space, because the organ is so powerful, the organ is so encompassing. And conceptually, I mean, that was also important because of talking about perhaps individual voices, the meaning of that. What that means to have an individual voice amongst others, or to contribute, in the round, or in a circle, a speaking circle, a talking circle.
Well, I found the tension in the piece, really spoke to the timelessness of the subject and the gravity of it.
Yeah, I'm really happy with the way it came out. I'm trying to think of ways to do it again, and uh, of course, it was written specifically for the organ that is there at that cathedral. But my next thing I got to learn is what how do I adapt it? What is common amongst a lot of these organs, and yeah, and what can be changed. I'm also not the type of composer that is too sacred about the score itself. in some ways, or the composition itself. I mean, I feel like there should be some fluidity built into all of these things that I make.
You're listening to the FutureStops podcast, an initiative of the Royal Canadian College of Organists. My name is Blake Hargreaves, and I'm your host as we explore the world of the 21st century organ. We just heard today's feature piece, an excerpt of Voiceless Mass by Raven Chacon, recorded in Milwaukee as part of Present Music's annual Thanksgiving concert. Besides being a composer and performer, Raven Chacon is an installation artist whose works have been exhibited as part of the Whitney Biennial, the Sydney Biennale, and at the Montreal Contemporary Art Museum. Chacon was a member of the Native American art collective Post Commodity, contributing to their internationally exhibited multimedia installations. He also is one of the earliest members of the Native American Composers Apprenticeship Project, serving as composer in residence since 2004.
That's a project that started in the year 2000. There's an annual festival out there called the Grand Canyon Music Festival, mostly chamber music festival that happens. It's actually been happening since the 80s. And around the year 2000 or so, they started this education project. You know, of course, they are on Navajo and Hopi and Supai lands, where the Grand Canyon is. And they came to the realization, yeah, maybe we should engage with this community, which I'm grateful for. They actually, it was founded with composer Brent Michael Davids. He's a native composer from Mohican tribe, so he's not from the region, but he thought up this idea to write string quartets with the young students there at those schools, and so he did it for a year. And I eventually, they said, we should get a composer from the region, if any exist. I mean, granted, even still, I mean, I can count the amount of Indigenous composers in the United States on two hands. There's probably 10 of us. And back 20 years ago, there was 4 of us. And so they had learned about my work. I mean, I was only maybe 25 or so back then, but they brought me out. And so that's the project. The project is well, they had started with one school, but when I joined on, I said, I want to teach students from the town I grew up in, which is Chinle, Arizona, near Canyon de Chelly. And it was an opportunity to expand. And the project is that I go out to these schools, usually for about a week, and give students, maybe about 5 to 10 students, the assignment of writing a 3-minute string quartet. And so with the schools where they have a music program, it's fairly easy. I go in and I show them everything I know about the strings that I can in a day. Extended techniques, all this stuff, how to get sound out of it, how to bow, all these things. And they start writing, and I show them the different clefs they'll have to write in. A student might only know treble clef, so I show them the other one. And then, yeah, we try to also talk about what music they know or they've been listening to. It might encompass traditional tribal music. A lot of these kids are like me. They listen to heavy metal or whatever, or some kids are hip hop or whatever. So all of that ends up. My faith is that it all ends up in their piece somehow. The schools where they don't have a music program, I have to show them what a whole note is, where middle C is, what middle C is. And sometimes, they only have a week. I've had students write an entire composition with just whole notes and maybe just middle C. One student just did, middle C and all whole notes, maybe some half notes. But that composition went through, all the timbres that were possible. And then that student does it the next year and then knows more, knows what the process is, tries different things, has been thinking about it for a year. I think I've probably taught about 300 kids to do this. Since 2004. And so I'm trying to make an archive that has all of these scores and recordings on there. And a really beautiful thing out of this, that very first year when Brent was teaching students, he only started with like 4 or 5. He taught a young composer out in Tuba City named Michael Begay. And when I started in 2004, I needed help just wrangling these students, and he was still in the area, and he became my assistant, and now he co-teaches the thing with me. He's co-composer, and he's getting his music degree at Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore now. So yeah, he's come up and he's doing this thing now too.
Raven Chacon's Voiceless Mass represents a novel and intriguing combination of theme and venue. The music's stillness and tension invites a refined and precise definition of hope. Creating a mass with no liturgical text offers a broad vista to those looking for an alternative use for sacred spaces, whose role is changing but whose possibilities are no less important in our lives as they were when these structures were built. As these spaces confront the silence of new occupants, they get closer to the true definition of sacred. As written in the description, quote, "Though Mass is referenced in the title, the piece contains no audible singing voices, instead using the openness of the large space to intone the constricted intervals of the wind and string instruments. In exploiting the architecture of the cathedral, Voiceless Mass considers the futility of giving voice to the voiceless when ceding space is never an option for those in power." We'd like to thank Raven Chacon for joining us today. We'd love it if you would join us too on social media at FutureStops and FutureStops Podcast, where you can bring your voice to the conversation. FutureStops is a podcast from the Royal Canadian College of Organists, produced by Andrew O'Connor with Sanjay Parker as community manager and executive producer Elizabeth Shannon. I'm your host, Blake Hargreaves.